Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely chilling piece of strategic analysis. So for 80 years, right, the global nuclear taboo has held completely firm. It's always relied on this baseline assumption that state actors are basically rational, that they'll respect physical boundaries, and crucially, that they'll maintain diplomatic off-ramps. But what happens when literally all of those assumptions just collapse? The source material we're looking at today introduces something called the Iran Omega Framework, and the thesis here is absolutely startling. It argues that breaking the nuclear taboo in the Middle East might no longer be some theoretical policy choice. It might actually be a mathematical inevitability.
So here's our roadmap for this perfect storm of converging vectors. First, the unthinkable becoming inevitable. Second, hitting the granite wall. Third, America's empty munitions magazine. Fourth, the foreclosure of diplomacy. And finally, the ignored apocalyptic counterstrike. All right, part one, the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Let's unpack this Iran Omega framework.
To really grasp this shift, we have to contrast two very different eras. Traditional Cold War-era deterrence was entirely built on avoiding existential corners, right? You relied on rational actors who had functioning off-ramps. But the report argues that following the intense regional conflicts of Operation Midnight Hammer in 2025 and Operation Epic Fury in early 2026, that old baseline is just shattered. Institutional resistance to nuclear deployment has basically collapsed. It's been replaced by a strategic board state that structurally forces a vertical leap straight to the nuclear threshold.
The authors synthesize this grim reality through the Iran Omega framework. Now, this isn't just some abstract political theory. It's a massive, multidisciplinary model. It looks at the physical limits of our weapons, the logistical nightmares of supply chains, the hard political mandates from lawmakers, and even the cognitive psychology of the leadership itself. The big takeaway you need to understand here is that this crisis isn't a single decision made by a single person in a room. It's a convergence of unstoppable structural forces. Moving on to part two, hitting the granite wall. This is all about the total failure of conventional power projection. So the primary operational goal for the U.S. has been dismantling Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and specifically the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. This is the place housing those advanced centrifuges enriching uranium to 60%. But the report points out a massive, literal geographic roadblock. We're not talking about a surface bunker covered in a pile of dirt. Fordo is buried 80 to 100 meters deep, directly inside a mountain of solid limestone and dolomite. That's practically a whole football field straight down into solid rock. This creates an impenetrable granite wall that completely upends the traditional rules of conventional aerial bombardment. Now, you might be thinking, don't we have bunker busters for that? Well, the U.S. Air Force does possess the absolute apex of conventional bunker-busting tech, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. But physics is incredibly unforgiving. The GBU-57 is hard-capped at about 60 meters of earth penetration, or roughly 18 meters of standard concrete. Fortaggio, meanwhile, sits far deeper, under rock with compressive strengths up to 25,000 psi, which is then reinforced by engineered concrete caps exceeding 30,000 psi. The weapon literally just lacks the kinetic energy to reach the bottom. But the U.S. actually tried to overcome this map in June 2025 during Operation Midnight Hammer. B-2 bombers executed an absolute marvel of military engineering. Step 1, the first weapon was perfectly timed to blast away that 30,000 psi concrete cap. Step 2, bombs 2 through 5 were precisely tasked to travel right down that newly uncovered shaft at over 1,000 feet per second, detonating progressively deeper. Officials confirmed it was a flawless execution. The explosions literally lit up the night sky like it was daytime. And yet, the deepest centrifuge hulls survived. The target is, for all intents and purposes, functionally immune to total conventional destruction. Which brings us to part 3, America's empty munitions magazine, and the logistical necessity of escalation. Okay, standard military doctrine says that if you can't destroy a target in one strike, you launch a protracted, multi-month campaign. But to do that, you need overwhelming supplies. During the incredibly intense 6-week conflict in early 2026, known as Operation Epic Fury, Navy destroyers and subs fired an estimated 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Over 1,000! And that's just one single type of munition. The U.S. essentially burned through roughly 30% of its entire pre-war ground strike inventory and 40% of its air and missile defense munitions in slightly over a single month. And to put that into perspective, look at this number, 86. That is the average annual procurement rate for Tomahawks over the past decade. Think about that for a second. The U.S. military burned through more than 10 years of Tomahawk supply in just a month and a half. The source analysis methodically walks us through this absolutely devastating math. When you look at replenishment timelines for vital systems like the Patriot, THAAD, and Standard missiles, they stretch way out to 2029 and 2030. So the conventional magazine is effectively empty. This entirely forecloses any option for fighting a protracted conventional war of attrition. You just can't fight a long war if you don't have the bullets. So why not just throw billions of dollars at the problem and build them faster? Well, the report notes that despite an $87.6 billion emergency supplemental request, you literally cannot print time. The U.S. defense industrial base is dealing with deep structural bottlenecks. We're talking highly constrained rare earth minerals, crazy shortages in specialized microelectronics, and a severe lack of advanced manufacturing workforce. These are highly complex weapons that inherently require years of lead time to build. So military planners are backed into a paralyzing binary choice. Either openly acknowledge a conventional defeat or escalate to a non-conventional weapon that requires just a single drop to fracture the mountain. This leads into Part 4, the foreclosure of diplomacy. We'll look at legislative handcuffs and cognitive degradation.
Logically, if the military can't physically or logistically achieve the objective, you pivot to diplomacy, right? But the political architecture here has been locked into place. The report traces how hawkish lobbying successfully pushed the West to trigger the UN's snapback sanctions in October 2025, right before they expired, permanently reviving international sanctions. Then, domestically, the bipartisan Enhanced Iran Sanctions Act acted as literal legislative handcuffs. It legally mandated the executive branch to maintain maximum economic warfare and strip the president's ability to even offer sanctions waivers. So by the time the Geneva negotiations rolled around in February 2026, talks totally stalled. U.S. negotiators were legally barred from offering concessions. The state apparatus has been completely transformed into a geopolitical battering ram that is prohibited from retreating.
And this political entrapment mixes incredibly dangerously with human psychology. Drawing on some really eye-opening findings from the Texas National Security Review, the report explores what they call the better bomb effect. Imagine being trapped in a frustrating military stalemate. Under the immense, crushing stress of high-stakes warfare, executive leadership can easily fall into a dominance execution loop. In that mindset, a nuclear strike is suddenly processed through a purely utilitarian lens. It stops being this world-ending taboo and basically becomes just a bigger hammer needed to pulverize a defiant obstacle, save face, and reestablish supremacy. And to make matters worse, the U.S. arsenal has evolved in a way that caters exactly to that utilitarian temptation. Older Earth-penetrating nukes, like the B-6111, they were unsteerable and relied on massive megatonnage. But the modernized B-6112 has a highly advanced precision steerable tail kit. Because a ground shockwave's destructive power drops off exponentially with distance, having extreme accuracy means the military can use a significantly lower nuclear yield to achieve massive subterranean destruction. It is honestly perfectly tailored for a frustrated military command staring at an empty conventional magazine. It provides this very dangerous illusion that a nuclear strike can somehow be localized and proportional. Finally, Part 5, the ignored apocalyptic counterstrike, revealing the ultimate blind spot. Normally, the sheer fear of mutually assured destruction would stop this kind of escalation dead in its tracks. But the report identifies a terrifying phenomenon it calls elite anisognosia. Think of it as an absolute institutional blindness among the strategic establishment to the external checks on their own power. It's rooted in this hubristic belief that the American homeland is functionally invulnerable to a regional power like Iran. And this blindness comes from a totally flawed threat model. Washington focuses heavily on the fact that Iran lacks advanced intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, the kind that can deliver a city-killing nuclear payload through the atmosphere. But the report argues that this focus is a huge distraction. It completely blinds leadership to Iran's actual asymmetric counterstrike capability, the high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, or HEMP. So a HEMP is generated by detonating a low-yield nuclear weapon hundreds of kilometers up in space. This blankets the continental power grid in an instantaneous electromagnetic shockwave. And the mechanics here are truly devastating. First comes the E1 wave, which instantly fries microprocessors before safety breakers even have the physical time to trip.
The E2 wave acts kind of like lightning, which is manageable, but then comes the E3 wave. This is a slow, incredibly powerful pulse that couples directly into transmission lines. It destroys the custom-built, totally irreplaceable extra-high voltage transformers that form the absolute backbone of our civilian electric grid. Without them, you're looking at a cascading, long-term civilizational collapse. No power, no water pumping, no supply chains indefinitely.
And here is the kicker. The delivery mechanism for this strike already exists today. Executing a HEMP entirely bypasses the need for complex, heavy, hypersonic reentry vehicles. The weapon literally just needs to reach space. The report emphasizes that Iran's space capability is already highly active. They successfully launched the Soraya satellite using their Gayam-100 space launch vehicle. A device placed in a standard orbit would pass over the United States completely invisible to our conventional ballistic missile warning architectures.
Which brings us to our final conclusion. The Iran Omega framework paints a harrowing picture of a nation being forced up the escalation ladder by an impenetrable mountain, an empty conventional magazine, and uncompromising political mandates. But the ultimate accelerant here is the false belief that they can cross the nuclear threshold with absolute impunity. So the question is, will leadership recognize this catastrophic asymmetric blind spot before the mathematical inevitability becomes an apocalyptic reality? It's a sobering thought and one that demands our closest attention. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.